It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Millbrook. Officer Nathan Brooks, a cop with over 10 years on the force, was driving down the same streets he had for years. He was used to the peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood, where everyone knew each other, and things rarely got out of hand. But today, something unexpected was brewing at the local park. It started when an older woman, Ms. Patterson, approached the playground where a group of children were playing. She was upset, complaining that one of the kids, a young black girl named Amara, had been rude. Amara, who was only 5 years old, had been playing tag with her friends. She was a curious and cheerful child, full of energy and joy. But to Ms. Patterson, something about Amara's laughter seemed out of place. Maybe it was because she thought Amara wasn't following the rules of play, or maybe she just didn't like how loud the children were. Regardless, she made the call to the police, and Officer Brooks was sent out to handle the situation. When Officer Brooks arrived, he saw the children running around and Amara, in particular, playing with her friends. The first thing that struck him was her innocent smile and the way she was just like any other child at the park. But instead of taking a moment to understand the situation, Brooks immediately approached Amara with a stern expression. He ordered her to stop and, without hesitation, slapped handcuffs on the little girl. The other children froze in shock, unsure of what was happening. As Amara's eyes filled with confusion and fear, she tried to explain herself. But Officer Brooks, annoyed by her attempts to speak, silenced her with a command. Within moments, the situation had escalated far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The crowd of people who had gathered began to pull out their phones, recording what was unfolding. It was clear that something was terribly wrong. Officer Brooks barely noticed the small crowd that had gathered, too focused on what he saw as insubordination from a child. As he placed the handcuffs on Amara's tiny wrists, she began to cry, confused and terrified. She had no idea why this stranger was treating her so roughly. Amara's mother, Keisha, had been running errands nearby when she got a call from a neighbor, telling her that something was happening at the park. Her heart sank as she hurried over, already sensing that something was terribly wrong. When Keisha arrived, she saw her daughter, just 5 years old, in handcuffs, standing helplessly beside Officer Brooks. Amara looked up at her mother with tear-filled eyes, her tiny body trembling. Keisha's shock quickly turned to fury. She rushed toward the officer, demanding to know why her little girl was being treated like a criminal. "What are you doing to my daughter?" Keisha shouted, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. Officer Brooks remained cold, offering no explanation. "She was being disruptive," he said, his tone dismissive. Keisha couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her daughter, a small child, was being arrested for playing, for laughing with her friends. It made no sense. A few people in the crowd, realizing what was happening, began to speak out, questioning the officer's actions. "You're arresting a little girl." One woman shouted, "What's going on here?" But Officer Brooks remained firm, ignoring the voices of concern around him. Keisha, desperate to get her daughter free, demanded that the officer remove the handcuffs immediately, but Brooks refused. The situation grew more intense as more people started recording the incident on their phones. Amara's cries filled the air, and the growing crowd began murmuring in disbelief. Keisha felt helpless, her heart aching for her daughter. What kind of world was this where a little girl was treated like a criminal? As the scene unfolded at the park, the growing crowd became more and more vocal. People pulled out their phones, recording every moment, while others began to voice their outrage. "You can't be serious. A 5-year-old." One man shouted, his voice shaking with disbelief. "This is ridiculous." Another person added. The onlookers couldn't believe what they were witnessing. A little girl in handcuffs, arrested for what seemed like nothing more than playing. Keisha stood there, her heart breaking, as her daughter cried in her arms. The mother tried to comfort Amara, telling her that everything would be okay. But the little girl was too scared to understand. It wasn't just the physical pain of the handcuffs that hurt. It was the deep confusion in Amara's eyes. Why was this happening to her? In the midst of the chaos, one of the witnesses, a young man named Malik, stepped forward. He had been watching from a distance and couldn't stay silent any longer. "This isn't right," he said, his voice loud and clear. "This is a little girl. Why is she being treated like a criminal?" His words caught the attention of the others in the crowd, and more people began to shout in support. The anger grew, and so did the feeling that something had to change. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much bigger. Within minutes, news outlets began to pick up the story, sharing footage from the bystanders' phones. Social media exploded with comments and reactions. People couldn't stop talking about the shocking video that showed a police officer arresting a small child. Hashtags like #JusticeForAmara and #EndPoliceBrutality started trending, as the story quickly gained attention far beyond the small town. Keisha's phone rang constantly as reporters and activists reached out, wanting to hear her side of the story. The phone calls felt endless, and yet Keisha wasn't sure how to process everything. How had it come to this? How could a simple, innocent moment turn into something that could change their lives forever? The outrage surrounding the arrest of Amara spread like wildfire. What started as a local incident quickly became a national story. News outlets picked up the footage, and it wasn't long before television stations were airing clips of Officer Brooks handcuffing the 5-year-old. The media coverage was relentless, showing the heartbreaking images of Amara's tear-streaked face as she stood helpless beside the officer. The #JusticeForAmara exploded across social media, and thousands of people began to share their outrage, demanding accountability. In Millbrook, the community that had once felt small and peaceful was now divided. Some residents supported Officer Brooks, claiming he was just doing his job. Others couldn't believe what had happened and were demanding justice for Amara. The debate grew heated as people argued back and forth, but no one could ignore the powerful images of a child in handcuffs, the fear and confusion written on her face. As the days went by, more information came to light. The police department, initially slow to respond, began an internal investigation into Officer Brooks' actions. They reassured the public that they were taking the matter seriously, but it was clear that the pressure was mounting. More witnesses came forward, some claiming that Brooks had acted aggressively in the past, while others spoke of racial profiling that seemed to follow him in his career. In a surprising turn, body camera footage from a previous incident, which had been kept under wraps, was leaked to the press. It showed Brooks using excessive force in a routine traffic stop and other instances of misconduct that had gone unpunished. The public was outraged again, but this time it wasn't just about Amara. It was about the broader pattern of abuse. Keisha watched the news coverage with mixed emotions. She was grateful for the support her family had received, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter's painful experience was just one example of something much bigger. As the story grew, so did the hope for change. People were beginning to demand real accountability, and the wheels of justice were slowly starting to turn. As the days passed, the story of Amara's arrest became a symbol of the larger issues that plagued the justice system. It wasn't just about the wrongful arrest of a 5-year-old anymore. It had turned into a movement. People all over the country were sharing their own stories of unfair treatment by the police, particularly in communities of color. The outrage sparked protests, peaceful marches, and calls for police reform. In cities across the nation, people were demanding that officers who abused their power be held accountable for their actions. Amara's case had become a rallying cry. Her innocent face, now known across social media and on news channels, had captured the hearts of millions. People saw her as a symbol of the unfairness and inequality that many children, especially children of color, faced every day. The #JusticeForAmara continued to trend, with supporters organizing events, signing petitions, and calling for the resignation of Officer Brooks. Back in Millbrook, the pressure on the local police department grew stronger. Public protests were organized outside the police station, with residents demanding answers and justice. Keisha, though overwhelmed by everything happening so fast, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as she watched the community come together. Despite her own pain, she knew that Amara's experience could spark change, and she wanted to be part of that change. The police department had no choice but to take action. Officer Brooks was put on paid leave pending the outcome of an investigation. Though it was only a temporary measure, it was a sign that the department was at least acknowledging the gravity of the situation. However, for many, this wasn't enough. People wanted justice, not just temporary suspensions. Meanwhile, Amara's family continued to receive support from all over the world. Strangers sent messages of encouragement, offering donations to help cover any legal fees or expenses. Keisha, although grateful for the support, couldn't stop thinking about the trauma her daughter had experienced. No matter how many people rallied behind them, she knew that Amara's life would never be the same after what had happened. As the investigation into Officer Brooks continued, the pressure on the police department reached new heights. The community, already shaken by the incident, began to demand real accountability. People weren't just calling for a suspension. They wanted justice. And for many, justice meant more than just holding one officer accountable. It meant fixing the system that allowed such abuses to happen in the first place. Keisha's life had changed overnight. She had become the face of a movement that was bigger than she ever imagined. She continued to speak out for her daughter, but now she was also speaking for all the families who had been treated unfairly by the police. She started attending community meetings and rallies, using her voice to demand not just answers but real change. Every day, more people reached out to her, sharing their own painful experiences with law enforcement. The stories were heartbreaking, but they were also powerful. They showed that Amara's experience wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a larger problem that needed to be addressed. Meanwhile, Officer Brooks remained on paid leave, and the police department had yet to take any significant action. The public's frustration grew as they waited for the department to act decisively. Then, a shocking development occurred. The police chief, under immense pressure, held a press conference where he announced that Officer Brooks would be facing charges. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. While many celebrated the news, others felt it was long overdue. The public wanted to see real consequences for his actions, not just a slap on the wrist. As the legal process began, Keisha found herself juggling the fight for justice with the daily needs of caring for Amara. The little girl, though still shaken by the events, had shown incredible strength. She spoke out in interviews, using her innocent voice to tell her story. Her courage inspired others, and her message resonated with people all over the country. But even as the wheels of justice slowly turned, Keisha knew that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. The fight wasn't over yet. There was still a long way to go before real change could be achieved. The legal battle surrounding Officer Brooks continued for months, but the public's attention never wavered. People were determined to see justice for Amara, and the movement that had begun with one child's arrest had now become a powerful force for change. Protests, rallies, and marches filled the streets across the country as people of all backgrounds came together to demand accountability and reform. It wasn't just about Amara anymore. It was about the thousands of families who had faced similar injustices and were still waiting for change. Keisha, still reeling from the events that had turned her life upside down, found herself at the center of it all. She had become a spokesperson for the fight against police brutality, and though she never expected this kind of attention, she knew that her voice mattered. With every interview, every speech, Keisha felt her resolve grow stronger. She knew that Amara's story had sparked something much bigger than herself, and that the fight for justice was far from over. In the courtroom, the pressure on Officer Brooks continued to mount. His defense team tried to argue that his actions were justified, that Amara's behavior had somehow warranted his arrest. But the evidence was overwhelming. The public's outrage, combined with the growing support for Amara and her family, made it clear that the case wasn't just about a single officer's mistake. It was about the systemic issues that allowed it to happen. The trial was a turning point, not just for Officer Brooks, but for the entire community. Finally, after months of uncertainty, the verdict came in. Officer Brooks was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. The courtroom erupted in applause as Keisha held Amara close, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't just a victory for their family. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been mistreated, for every voice that had spoken out against injustice. Though the victory felt sweet, Keisha knew the work was far from over. The fight for true reform was just beginning, and Amara's story would continue to inspire others to stand up, speak out, and demand change. It was a long road ahead, but with each victory, the light of hope grew brighter.